Today's video is going to be focused on learning about Buddhism. You know a bit about Buddhism because you'll see here soon that there are some similarities to Hinduism. Both religions are Eastern religions, which, if you remember from the last video, means that they got their start in the Eastern Hemisphere. And in this case, and in the case of Hinduism, most of their followers are still living and located in the Eastern Hemisphere. Buddhism got its start in this small country called Nepal. Nepal is located to the northeast of India. It's part of the Indian subcontinent. You may have heard it in the news last winter or spring, I don't remember which. There was a bad earthquake there. Nepal is also where Mount Everest, the tallest peak on the earth, is located. You can see the darker red color. This is where the most Buddhists live. Tibet is going to be something that comes up later in this video. We see China, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Most of the Eastern Asian countries have Buddhists. Buddhism got its start about 2,500 years ago. So there was a guy, his name was Siddhartha Gautama. He was born very lucky. He was born the prince of a small kingdom in Nepal, the country I just showed you. And he lived a very privileged life. He never left the palace, so he did not see the suffering that occurred outside the palace walls until one day when he wanted to know more about the world and his faith. He left the palace. He saw that there was suffering, and he was appalled. He wanted to know why there was so much suffering. So at age 29, he set out to find a way to essentially to stop the suffering. And Siddhartha Gautama is who we call the Buddha. Legend says that the Buddha sat under a tree and he contemplated and really he meditated. Legend says he stayed there for 49 days, and then finally he awoke and was transformed into the Buddha. And he became very knowledgeable, and he wanted to share his knowledge with the rest of the world. So the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, when he lived, he went around India teaching, counseling, preaching. He meditated, he spent time with monks in prayer, and he stood up against the caste system because the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, was himself a Hindu until he decided that he wanted to change and develop this new religion called Buddhism. So we will see that a lot of what he taught to Buddhists has similarities to Hinduism because it branched off. One principle of Buddhism, which is similar to Hinduism, is this idea of reincarnation. In Hinduism, we called it samsara. We don't say that for Buddhism. But what we do see is that there is an idea similar to Hinduism that people can be reborn after they die. So you could die, come back to Earth, and have a different personality, a different body. You could be a different species. So same thing we saw when we talked about Hinduism and being reincarnated. Except the thing here is that in order to stop the cycle, there's a different term for it. In Buddhism, it's called nirvana. Yes, there was a 90s grunge band called Nirvana, and that's where they got their name, because the idea of nirvana is a really good one. It means being released from reincarnation. So it stops that cycle of dying and being reborn and dying and coming back to Earth. So that term is nirvana. Buddha himself did not write down any of his teachings. It was passed by word of mouth. Eventually, 300 years after his death, they started to be written down, and that's probably why we still have Buddhism today and that people are knowledgeable about it. Something called a pagoda or a stupa is a place of worship. It's a temple. So the central teachings of Buddhism, there is one thing called the Four Noble Truths. You probably saw this, remember this from your pre-assessment that you took last week. The Four Noble Truths. So essentially, there are four philosophical statements. They're the truths. And that means that they're these things that are essential to all living beings. And maybe you'll agree with these. I had spoken before that Buddhism is so much a spiritual element that you can be a practicing Christian or a practicing Muslim and still believe in some of this stuff. So they can overlap because this is not so much about believing in a higher power as just understanding humanity. So one thing that I think we can all agree on is that life is full of suffering. Buddha decided, though, that all suffering is caused by personal desire. So you might suffer because you want something. You might say, oh, the kid sitting next to me in class has an iPhone and I really want an iPhone, so I'm going to be grouchy and jealous and depressed. Well, you're acting that way. You're suffering because you are desiring something. The Buddha also said that desire can be overcome. You don't have to desire things. But that sounds a lot easier said than done, right? So he came up with something even more specific, and he said, the way to overcome desire is to follow the Eightfold Path. So, Four Noble Truths, there are 4 steps. Guess what? The Eightfold Path? It has 8. So there are 8 things that Buddhists would do to not feel the need to suffer. They would focus on these things so that they are not desiring. And these are things like the right knowledge, the right intent, the right speech, right conduct, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. Essentially what this means, do the right thing, okay? So speak well of others. Assume positive intent. Don't expect that other people are there to talk behind your back or to rob you or to hurt you. Right mindfulness, again, is thinking positively, not expecting that people are bad, or not thinking that not saying, oh, I don't like so-and-so. Right conduct, conducting yourself in a positive manner so that you are acting appropriately. I think I need to stop the video because she's whining.